Great. Good evening. And right now we have with us the Reverend Canon Janet Waggoner. And thank you for being here this evening.
You're welcome. It's a privilege.
Yes. And I have your first question for you.
Okay.
As a bishop, this is in future, you as bishop, so there's some clarification required for this question. As a bishop, who in your past or present would be your personal role model, and what do you find most admirable in their style of life and leadership?
Oh gosh. I have like 20 answers to this question because I am a student of leadership and spiritual disciplines. So I kind of need a category. So I'll give you a category. In terms of leadership outside the Episcopal Church, someone I follow on a regular basis is Bill Belichick, who is the, you know who he is? Do some of you? He is the coach of the New England Patriots, who have sometimes been in trouble. Yes, I know, but that man has built a team. He's built a team that has equitable pay. Tom Brady, though he is perhaps the GOAT, is not the most moneyed quarterback ever, nor will he ever be, because he's never going to leave the Patriots until he retires, and he's totally okay with that. So I think leaders who lead with a team heart and spirit, that's a huge thing for me. Another personal role model in terms of leadership for me is Michelle Obama. Her whole thing about when they go low, we go high. As you know, they were the folks who've lived in the White House the longest with the least amount of scandals. And you know, that whole living with integrity, I want to follow that. In our own church, two people who are role models for me are Catherine Jefferts Shorey, who I have known since she was an assistant priest in the Diocese of Oregon. She was on the standing committee that approved me for ordination. You know, I think it was an incredibly gutsy thing for her to do, to say yes to standing for presiding bishop and for serving for 9 years in the face of incredible, sometimes just flat out rejection. And your own bishop, Mary Gray Reeves. I would not be standing here without her leadership because, as you probably know, one of her commitments is bringing more women into leadership. So that's a sampling.
Great. So what has been your experience in using community organizing tools to seek ways to engage and minister with people outside the walls of the church? And would you encourage ECR to further embrace community organizing?
I'm curious, how many of you currently have been involved in some kind of community organizing thing? Wow, excellent. So I took community organizing seminars about 15 years ago, before people really sort of knew what that was, in the region of the country where I was. I'm well aware that community organizing has been around for a lot longer than that. So primarily I have experience with community organizing in two ways. One is in inner city communities where people were mobilizing to take care of a local issue. And another is churches coming together around an issue. So that's my experience. Would you encourage? Yes. And since you already know what those tools are, and I assume are using them to some degree, well, maybe we could work on that. That's the trick, right, is to then flex those muscles in our communities using those tools. And the community organizing tools are very much listening tools and bridge building tools, and they're action-oriented tools. So I think they're very fitting for our time.
Great, thank you. As bishop, what would you do to address shrinking, aging congregations that are moving toward unsustainability?
The first thing I would do is love them. People won't listen to you, and quite frankly, they won't listen to you, and I would venture to say they shouldn't listen to you as a leader unless you love them. So I grew up in a very small church in a very small town in Washington State. In our own diocese, I spend more time with the smaller churches than I do with the bigger churches because they need more stuff. So first, love them. Second, be with them. I take a regular kind of supply rotation. So when I'm not doing something else on a Sunday morning, I go down to Hamilton, which is 8, maybe 10 people on a Sunday. I go down to Hillsborough, maybe 10, 12. So, and I love it. I love it. Folks in those small churches have often been there for generations in their family, and they're also folks who have connections in the community, and those congregations do a ton of caring. Now, this question about sustainability. I think one of the things we need to be aware of when we talk about sustainability is that congregations are called for a purpose, and almost every congregation I know has the resources it needs to fulfill that purpose. And if it doesn't, then that's a place where the diocese can come along and help. But the thing about purpose is there are a lot of things out there that don't require a lot of money, right? Anyway, that's a start. Also, just lost my train of thought. The other thing about sustainability is we often have unrealistic expectations of ourselves, and that is why we think of ourselves as unsustainable. One of our congregations, I went there one Sunday and they said, we are just so exhausted by all of the altar guild stuff, and Father so-and-so won't let us use silk flowers on the altar, and so we have to go down, and it's far away to get flowers. And I said, well, have you thought about, would you like to use silk flowers or no flowers? And they were like, oh yeah, that would be so great. So the bishop and I gave them permission to use silk flowers, and the next time I went, they were a little more buoyant as a community. So I think that's another role of the bishop, is to give permission and say yes to what people need.
Thank you. Next, what might be your vision of working with a council of deacons rather than an archdeacon, and what is your vision of how the diaconate in ECR might develop and expand?
My general leadership approach is partnership. So whether you have an archdeacon or whether you have a council of deacons, and I don't think those need to be mutually exclusive, by the way, the partnership thing is the most important thing. In my experience, our deacons have a special relationship with the bishop, and I would very much want to have that intentional relationship with the deacons in our communities, and to enhance the ministries of our deacons and their congregations. I understand that there is a need and a desire to raise up more folks for the diaconate, and someone just said also for the priesthood. For me, discernment starts from the ground up. And my experience is, if in our congregations we are exploring what it means to be ministers, ministers, all the baptized, right? We talk about the ministry of all the baptized. Well, if we're exploring that, if we're talking about spiritual gifts, if we're encouraging people to use their spiritual gifts, then the vocation conversation that's specific to those particular roles sorts itself out. Another key element of that conversation is Christian education, continual learning about our tradition and the scriptures.
Thank you. Another long one, so you'll be there for a while. Many of our parishes have implemented and practiced open communion, in which all, no matter where they are on their spiritual journey, are welcome to receive communion. Please discuss your position on open communion. What would your directions to diocesan clergy be on the issue?
I'm not sure the camera should be on for this part. You don't want your bishop to give you direction on this point, I think, because the canons of the Episcopal Church say explicitly that communion is for those who are baptized. That's in the canons. Our ecclesiastical discipline canons say that any clergy person, deacon, priest, or bishop can be brought up on charges for not following the canons. See where I'm going with this? So the only direction that your bishop can give you that is canonical is not to do open communion. What other option than directing you does your bishop have? That's right. She's doing hands-off sign, right? I know that lots of your congregations practice open communion. Lots of our congregations practice open communion. I personally have seen people come to Jesus, come to a deeper understanding of their spirituality, of their community, from being at the table. And I don't want to deny that to folks. And by the way, if we say all are welcome in our congregations, but then we say, oh, but we don't mean at the table. Oh, and we don't mean over here this thing. And oh, by the way, don't come to vestry meeting. Then all are not welcome. So I personally think that we need to change the canons to reflect the practice that seems to be what we are discerning into as a body of Episcopalians. The tricky part is ecumenical relationships, right? Because if we want to build bridges and have ecumenical relationships, deep ecumenical relationships with other traditions, and we make that rule, that can affect our ability to do that.
Thank you. Please tell us your theology. Please tell us about your theology and practice of Christian stewardship and your views about the biblical tithe. Do you personally practice the tithe? Would you put a priority on energizing attitudes about stewardship, and how would you, as the bishop, do this as the Bishop of El Camino Real?
In our household, we do practice the tithe: time, talent, and treasure. Time, talent, and treasure. So when we talk about stewardship, I think we need to talk about whole life stewardship. And so that's the first piece of my theology. Another piece of my theology is understanding the generosity of God toward us and letting God fill us up enough that then giving is not a chore or a duty, but it's a joy. I I would guess that you have heard the phrase, give until it hurts. I do not believe that is good Christian theology.
No, thank you.
I am very, very certain God did not say that in the Bible. My theology is, give until it heals. Give until it creates equity. Give until you make the kind of difference in the community that you want to make, that you feel called by God to make because God is generous to you, and out of that you long to be generous to others. And yes, I would put a priority on energizing attitudes about stewardship. And before I was a priest, I was a development director for a food bank. And I think that it's really important in our congregations to be able to talk about money in healthy ways. And so I'm all about that. I'm all about asking for what we need, being honest about what we need, being honest about what might be extra, and sharing. Because my experience is that when we know what we need, and we let our communities know about that, there are ways to meet needs, personal and corporate.
Thank you. Again, as a bishop, who in your past or present would be your personal, didn't we do that one?
Yeah,
We did that one. Oh, we're done with all the questions. So, timekeeper, do we have time for another question? Okay, thank you. Any other, anyone, any question?
We could have her answer the question again, see if the answer is the same.
We could. There's
I was having a little, like deja vu moment there. We answer these questions 4 or 5 times at every walkabout, and I was just thinking, I thought I answered that in this room.
Sorry, David.
Okay, Janet, you talked about visiting small parishes with 10 or 12 people. So, and sustainability of a parish, what do you do about keeping priests in those parish? I mean, I'm just curious because
it's difficult, right? So in our diocese, when I first started in this role 6 years ago, it seemed like we had priests and to spare. And so we had a priest. There was a time between about 5 years ago and about 2 years ago that every congregation in our diocese had a priest every Sunday. Right now, that's not true. Right now, we have 2 congregations that don't have a priest every Sunday. And it's interesting, they're very, very different congregations. And one of them is like happy to do morning prayer, and they would like a priest to come once a month and serve communion, and they would like a priest for High Holy Days, and they're great. The other congregation, it is a deep hardship for them not to have a priest every Sunday, just because that's their table fellowship is their thing. And so the bishop and I try really hard to get priests out there as often as we can. And so that's what we do.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Another question? Okay.
That's not a sufficient answer, right?
Well, it's a complicated thing. And,
I'm just going to have to cut you off there because there's no follow-up on questions.
That's fine.
Yeah, thank you. Any questions? Mary's had one, but if there's not another one, I'll take Mary. All right. Okay. Sugiying, just one moment. Climb these stairs. Sugiying.
Yes, I'm thinking about one of the answers you gave about the communion and the tension between Canon and the emerging spirit as we practice what's going on. And you don't even have to talk about just communion, right? What the ordination of women, we tested ecumenical relationships with the ordination of gay, etc., etc. I guess I want to know how you would abide in the tension being one who represents the ecclesiastical order and under canons yourself, and as our diocese, might be pulled in a direction that would be divergent. How would you lead us, how would you discern how to be in that liminal place?
Thank you, that's a great question, because it's true. And I know that everyone thinks that Fort Worth is a really conservative place. And in fact, the city of Fort Worth was the only large city in the country that went red in the last election. Okay, so that gives you kind of a picture. And there are thousands and thousands of people moving into Fort Worth every year. And those folks aren't from Fort Worth. So the tone of that community is really changing. So I face that all the time. I face that as a rector, actually. Living in that tension between, really, it's between the already and the not yet. It's really a prophetic place of what is possible and being willing to explore that with folks that are ready for that. And the best way I know to do that is to talk about it, to talk openly and honestly about so like, for me to be honest, when I'm in tension over something, is really important. When I'm torn about something. It's also really important in those conversations where there's tension to allow folks to speak, not only allow, invite folks to speak on both sides of the question and in all the places in the middle, right? Because too often we tend the poles, but not the middle. So living in that tension is a spiritual practice. And I think it's called being prophetic. So that's how I do it. And I am well aware that as a rector, as a canon, as a bishop, I will disappoint some people because I won't uphold their perspective. What I desperately hope people know and will learn about me, I hope people here would learn about me what they know in Fort Worth and in Connecticut, and that is, I love you, even if I don't agree with you. And I will respect you, and I will invite other people to respect you, whether or not I agree with you.
Thank you very much, the Reverend Canon Janet Waggoner. Thank you for this evening.